Thanks, Caroluk, and welcome to our guests this morning. I think it's a very, very important subject matter, and it's good that we're having this conversation in regards to this issue. And I think we can't, when we speak about eating disorders, and there's a full spectrum of eating disorders, we can't talk about eating disorders if we don't talk about the society that we live in. And there's a huge amount of pressure, particularly on young people, to look a certain way. And that manifests in all sorts of ways. And I suppose 20 years ago, a lot of people got their, obviously television and radio was obviously prevalent. But there was a prevalence of what I would call glamour and gloss magazines, particularly how women should look. And that kind of stuff is it's insidious in relation to how young women should look. And that trickles down into certain manifestations, particularly around eating disorders. And obviously social media it brings them to a different platform, and a lot of young people will use that and will have a lot of influence in relation to what they see and what they hear. And I think that influence can really distort somebody's image of themselves via body shaming, the amount of pressure is put on young people to look a certain way. And this stuff is peddled sometimes by huge companies, big multinationals, for the glamour industry, and that kind of, I suppose, conscientious kind of marketing has a terrible effect on young people, and that can be overstated. So, in that situation, where young people they manifest an eating disorder, and I said there's a full spectrum of that, and we've seen it over, especially in the last 2.5 years, COVID. That has there's been an acceleration of that, and there's been a number of factors why that has happened. So just a number of questions. My first question is in relation to public and private, health service. But generally, from my understanding, the vast majority of inpatient beds for eating disorders are in the private sector. I'm correct on that, am I?
Adult.
I'm correct on that?
Yes, Gino.
Yes.
Okay. And for a young person under the age of 18, if they have an eating disorder, where would that young person be directed to if it's an inpatient, situation?
Okay, I'll take the social media piece, and then I'll come to you on the beds. Okay. Deputy Kenny, thank you very much for your questions. And if it's okay with you, I'll just give a quick response on the social media piece, and then I'll ask my colleague to take up your question in relation to child and adolescent beds for eating disorders. So just around, I suppose, the activity on social media, and it's a very valid and valuable space, particularly for young people. It's something that they engage with continuously. We recognise also that it's a space potentially that could have messages that may not be appropriate. So Bodywise engaged with a lot of the social media companies, Facebook, which I think is now Meta, Instagram and TikTok, for example, and we've been doing that regularly over the past few years. And this was really to work with them in identifying inappropriate material, particularly that would not be age appropriate, so maybe advertising, emaciated images, etc., but also advertising for, say, dietary products that will be particularly focused. So they have, they've put in provisions for safety provisions, particularly for age appropriate, and also we've worked with some of their staff just to work with them about identifying what we would have concerns with in relation to eating disorders, body image, the media literacy, as we mentioned earlier. So that's an ongoing process, and it's a process that we've welcomed. And we worked actually with our colleagues in the UK BEAT, because obviously these are international platforms, so you want to try and get the reach, the safety reach, as far as possible. So, Deputy Kenny, my colleague Carrick's going to answer your question about the adolescent inpatient beds. Okay.
So if you have a person who's under 18, who has been assessed to need an inpatient bed, or who is very unwell and it's obvious that they need an inpatient bed, they'll most likely go to one of the children's hospitals. So Crumlin, Temple Street, Tala, in Cork, the Cork University Hospital, Galway University Hospital. So it depends on where they are in the country. So they will, if they're physically very unwell, that's where they will go, and they will be stabilised, and then they will then be discharged into one of the inpatient CAMS beds, which is Lindara or Merlin Park or Aishlin in Cork, or there's St. Joseph's as well in North Dublin. It depends. I mean, so every situation is different, really. So it's difficult to say this is the way it will happen, because I suppose at the moment every situation is different, and that's one of the things that is important to get right in the development of services, is consistency, so that I would be able to say to you, definitely, this is what would happen. And at the moment, I suppose I can't say for sure, unless you want to say an area.
And in relation to an adult,
Yeah.
where would they be directed to? There's obviously a number of facilities that obviously has been mentioned before, but generally that's where would that person generally go? The adult that has an eating disorder.
To wherever the general hospital is in their area. If they're physically unwell, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they would present themselves to A&E maybe, and be admitted into a general hospital. So that's why it's so important that within the general hospitals that there is education and training. So for example, the training that I've been doing in partnership, but also the medical emergency guidelines, what are known as the Marzipan guidelines. That name will be changing, and on Thursday it's changing, but the Marzipan guidelines are for the management of really sick patients with anorexia. So they are guidelines for when somebody who is really sick goes into a general hospital. They are the guidelines that they need to follow in terms of ensuring that they get the proper treatment and care. And then there are the junior Marzipan guidelines, which would be for the children's hospital. So for example, I would know that in Crumlin, the nurses in A&E would have a copy of the junior Marzipan guidelines there. If there's a new nurse, they would take the time to go through them. They would be to make sure that they know what they are. So they're very important. And you will have seen during Eating Disorders Awareness Week that the HSE held a webinar, a full day webinar on the guidelines, bringing in, also there's Beaumont, so bringing in, gastroenterologists from Beaumont, psychiatrists from all hospitals all around the country, talking about how they implement the Marzipan guidelines within the hospital setting.
Is there a situation where somebody goes to A&E that in order to access inpatient care, they would have to be sectioned? Have you ever heard of that situation?
Yeah, well, yeah. Do you want to answer it?
For somebody to be an involuntary patient, it's often a decision which is taken by a consultant who would, we'd have, from a body-wise perspective, we'd have no involvement in a medical decision, but that is usually taken from a consultant's perspective, and it would be under the Mental Health Act.
Right, and it has happened. It has happened.
It has happened. There have been some cases in the past where there would have been an application to the courts in order to perhaps make somebody a ward of court because they're probably so physically and mentally compromised, which is, we would have made a submission around all of this to the Mental Health Act, which I know is under review at the moment, and it would have been very much around capacity to consent and advance directives. So again, these are elements, I suppose, that would be welcome in the new change from the Act.
And what happens in a situation where somebody refuses to eat completely? Is there a provision at the moment where somebody can be, for want of a better word, force-fed? Is there situations that actually can happen in a medical environment?
So that does happen. Absolutely, that happens when you have somebody who is, has a very, very low BMI, who is essentially starving, and they can't think straight. They, feel very defended because they're going into hospital. They can refuse. So, in as much as possible, the consultant or the team will not force feed them if they can in any way not do it. But if it is a question of life or death, they have to intervene. And so in that case, they will nasogastrically feed that patient. And that's where you get into a situation where somebody, where the High Court will become involved and where the person will be made a ward of court. And that can often be done with the parents, consent as well, that they also can't get their child, be it an adult child or an adolescent, where they can't get them to eat and there's nothing that they can do. So they need somebody to step in and say, okay, well, we're going to save them. It's far from an ideal situation, and everybody recognises that. Nobody wants to be in a situation where somebody is force-fed, because it's not conducive to recovery. It's not conducive to having somebody trust the doctors around them. So it's really only done when there's no other option.
And I'm guessing it's quite a rare event that would happen, where somebody that has an eating disorder that goes such kind of, I suppose, down the road of coming to the conclusion where they have refused all fluids and all kind of food, that situation arises. So I'm guessing that's rare.
The majority of people can be treated within the community. The majority of people don't get to that point.
Okay.
It would be very rare.
Just my final question, just in relation to COVID and eating disorders. And I think we all have kind of an idea why this has happened. I think in relation to eating disorders, somebody that would manifest an eating disorder, it's sometimes about control, where they've lost control in their life, a traumatic event, and that kind of manifests by somebody having refusing food and self-esteem and all that goes with it. So it's a highly complex issue. But why, in your opinion, particularly in the last 2.5 years, that there's been almost an acceleration in relation to eating disorders, particularly for young people, in the last 2.5 years?
Well, I suppose, Deputy, from our services perspective, we absolutely see that. So the figures, if I look at 2019, we would have had maybe 4,100 people who would have been supported by us. 2021, that would have been 9,000. So it's really nearly doubled. And actually with those figures, I'm leaving out the pillar support, which doubled as well. I would think that COVID-19 and the ensuing restrictions were almost like a perfect storm for eating disorders, and particularly when one thinks of child and adolescents and the inability to go to school, the sense of not being able to be with peers, the focus that there might have been around food and baking, and there was a sense that we saw reflected on our services where people in lockdown almost needed to become their best selves when they came out. And so what we saw was in the first wave, there was an increase in the services that we kind of thought might relax, but it didn't. It kept going. And so some of our highest figures are actually from 2021, and that kind of it might have been around the third wave of kind of Christmas to April, May of that year, where the figures are very, very high. I don't know if you want to add to that, Harriet, in terms of your sense of COVID.
I think that one of the things that happened in COVID was, and you spoke about social media, but it was that idea of we're all locked down, we don't have anyone to know to bounce off, to know what anyone else is doing, and everybody is presenting their best selves online, on their social media. And at the same time as that, you have all the normal routines that fell away, so people start to instate boundaries and routines, and that coupled with, well, what is everyone else doing, and what if I'm not doing what everyone else is doing? It's like this big kind of should came over, and that's perfect environment for an eating disorder to flourish. So you have people who might have had a vulnerability towards being anxious, perfectionist, high achieving. Suddenly there are no standards to which they can measure themselves, so of course they're going to measure themselves against the highest possible standards. So they start running marathons around their estate. They start saying, well, they can only eat during such and such times. And what we saw was loads of people just tipped into an eating disorder. So it was all those things all together, as Kathy said, that perfect storm just all happened at the same time.
And I think a tipping point as well was the cyber attack on the HSC, which then meant that a lot of appointments had to be cancelled or appointments were moved online. So there was all sorts of factors that you could never have anticipated between COVID and the cyber attack, that it was just the perfect storm just during that particular period of time. Kathy, you want to...
Thank you very